change is already here. We're seeing signs of it throughout Florida, effects on weather, wildlife, and even your health. We're going to go over it all in this special. It's heavy, but we've also found a little bit of hope. Projects already underway to help protect this great place we call home. So settle in to learn more about climate change, our new normal. Florida's beauty is what makes it paradise. The blue Gulf waters and sugar sand beaches. Nature, complemented by the laid-back lifestyle us Floridians know best. But it's this very locale, a state surrounded by more than 1,300 miles of coastline, that also makes us a prime target for climate change. And some of those impacts are already here.
Those winds are coming and shoving that water right into Tampa Bay.
The waves are getting stronger. They're starting to crash right over the side.
You really can't tell where the bayou ends and the road begins.
Now the big question is, could this be our new normal? We live in the Sunshine State and know what kind of weather to expect most of the year. But even that is changing over time. Small differences in the average weather conditions meteorologists like ours reference in their weekly forecasts.
I'm Mike Clay, Chief Meteorologist at Spectrum Bay News 9. The National Weather Service has a climate center in North Carolina, and every decade one of their duties is to look at the average of the last 30 years at all of these weather stations all over the United States. And then from that, they come up with what they call the normals.
For viewers at home, those new normals act as a baseline, something to put the forecast into perspective, with the most recent numbers released in May. That data shows Tampa Bay's annual high jumped from 81.4 to 83 degrees, and the annual rainfall from 46.30 inches to 49.48.
To the normal person, you probably don't even notice it. But as a climatologist would look at that, and they would look at tons of data over decades and decades, and if you start to see a departure of 1 or 2 degrees, then that is significant.
I'm Gary Mitchum. I'm a professor of physical oceanography, which is ocean physics, at the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida. The thing that concerns me most about the rainfall patterns, if the air is warmer, even if it doesn't increase a lot, you have more potential for very high rain rates. So there's just more water in the air in an absolute sense. Those are the kind of downpours that are going to affect our ability to run the water off and not cause flooding. We don't worry just about sea level rise flooding now. We worry about rainfall flooding. We're being hit from both sides. The second thing is there's good evidence that we're going to have storms that are slower moving and very heavy rain producers.
Consider the unprecedented and deadly flooding of Hurricane Harvey in 2017 as it stalled over Texas for days. And just this summer, Hurricane Ida, its remnants dumping record rainfall in parts of the Northeast, leaving New York City to declare its first ever flash flood emergency as water filled subway stations and covered major highways.
As we look into the future, the new normal is going to be that all of these things are predicted to be more frequent.
You can almost set your clock to afternoon storms in the summertime. And with an increased rain rate, it's not just the big ones that could flood your neighborhood.
My name is Claude Tankersley, and I'm the Public Works Administrator for the City of St. Petersburg. Our systems were designed at a time that had certain conditions. The bay is at least 8 inches, maybe more, higher than it was back in the 1940s. And 8 inches doesn't sound like a lot, but in such a flat area as we are, 8 inches can mean the difference between a street flooding every now and then or not.
And here's why. Stormwater pipes are installed at a slight angle, so gravity can guide water entering at one end out the other and into, say, the bay. If the bay then rises, covering some if not all of the pipe, it makes outflow harder. Add more rainfall and the problem becomes even worse. We got a look at this very situation along Bayshore Drive. This is a perfect example of the water now having to fight to get out.
That's exactly right. When this outfall was originally installed, it was right above the water line. And now you can see that it's partially submerged and it's not even high tide. You might have a street that in the past would flood maybe once a year for maybe an hour during one particular storm. Now it's flooding maybe 6 times a year for 2 hours. And so that's going to be the conversation we have to have with the public. What is more important to you? To have a street that never floods ever, and if that's what's important, then are you willing to pay millions upon millions, if not billions of dollars to reach there?
$3.2 billion to be exact, over the course of 20 years. That according to an assessment that took into consideration all of the city's aging water infrastructure. Across the bay, the city of Tampa already approved and started its own plan with a similar price tag that will ultimately double water rates by 2028 to help pay for it. Important to note here, data had to be collected and assessed before developing these plans. And now bipartisan legislation passed just this year will help other cities do the same through grant money from the state. Florida will also be required to have its own statewide plan by the end of 2023. In the thick of it all, Dr. Gary Mitchum and the team at USF's College of Marine Science with the establishment of an on-campus hub that will help coordinate the efforts.
I think the future is bright in a fashion. You know, the good news is the science is solid and getting better, so we can assess the impacts. If you know the impacts and you know what's coming, then you can figure out how to prepare.
Making it possible to adapt to our so-called new normal and mitigate impacts before it's too late. As you just saw, how climate change could affect your neighborhood or potentially your wallet is of great concern, but sometimes we need just a little reminder that it's more than just us out there. Coming up, we'll hear from one of the region's lead conservationists who has a lot to say about how climate change will impact our beloved wildlife. Florida, isn't it beautiful? I mean, really, it's why so many of us choose to live here. But as I said, things are changing, and our new normal is causing trouble for the region's wildlife. So let's dive in and find out exactly what's being done to help. The Gulf of Mexico shimmers in the sunlight as light blue waters give way to darker. Hidden underneath, another world of intricate ecosystems, intertwined and endlessly connected. A delicate balance, now interrupted by the rising tides and temperatures of climate change.
My name is Dr. Deborah Luke, and I am the Senior Vice President of Conservation at the Florida Aquarium. Florida has the 3rd largest barrier reef in the world. That barrier reef is doing exactly what its name says. It's a barrier. So when you think of tidal flow and impacts from the ocean, it does an amazing job. If we didn't have those reefs, the impacts of the storms would be so much worse than they are already.
Coastline protection is just the start. Coral reefs serve as a nursery and feeding grounds for hundreds of thousands of different aquatic species, an ecosystem that directly impacts the world's food chain right on up to the commercial fishing industry that feeds us. Tourism, too, with NOAA valuing the reefs in southeast Florida at $8.5 billion worth of economic impact. Simply put, the ripple effect of coral loss would be devastating both in and out of the water.
Climate change is affecting reefs in a variety of different ways. The first and foremost way that we see the biggest impact is with the changing water temperatures. Corals have symbionts. It's algae that actually live in with the actual baby corals and adult corals. It's what gives the corals their color. And when the water gets warmer, those symbionts move out of the coral. That's what causes coral bleaching. So we're seeing a lot of that, not only here in Florida, but we see it around the world.
Making the conservation efforts by the Florida Aquarium more urgent than ever before, something we saw firsthand on our visit to their Apollo Beach campus.
What we're really excited about is we have our induced spawning laboratory here, where we have tanks that we put corals in. And we have artificial lighting in there, LED lighting, that's all computerized. So it matches the environmental conditions of the Florida Keys. And what we've been able to do in the last 3 years is induce the coral to spawn at the exact time it's spawning in the wild.
The coral babies are then raised in coral greenhouses, a slow but rewarding process that ends with outplanting at sea of what Dr. Luke calls more resilient corals.
If we know that coral A seems to do better in warmer waters, we can breed it with coral B and see if coral AB babies are a little bit more resilient to warmer waters. And that's really a key component. We can raise all the corals we want here, but if we put them back out there and they don't survive, why are we doing that? The key is we need to be on the forefront, cutting edge, and that's what we're doing, of looking at how to make corals more resilient and protecting them along the way.
In turn, protecting the biodiversity of an underwater ecosystem that includes yet another species being looked after on the same campus.
So a lot of the impacts that we're seeing with coral reefs due to climate change, we're seeing impacts with all different species, and sea turtles are no exception. Sea turtles migrate, and they use very strong currents that typically follow migration patterns each year. What we're seeing is, as the water warms, those currents are changing, which means the turtles change direction and move, but there may not be the prey species that they need there.
These ones in particular were cold stunned and fighting for survival when they arrived.
You all have had to rehab an unusually big number of turtles this year.
We have. We've doubled our capacity so far this year. Typically, we bring in about 30 to 35 a year. We've brought in 32 already.
Some of them from as far away as New England.
What we're seeing is shifts in when it starts to get cold. We're also seeing shifts depending on where you live in the country, where some places are getting colder. It's climate change. It's not just global warming, it's climate change.
And it's impacting all of Florida's 5 species, each listed as either endangered or threatened. A status made worse by Florida's eroding shorelines, due in part to rising tides and intensifying storms.
That's where sea turtles nest. That's where they lay their eggs. If they come up each summer and there's nothing to lay eggs on, they don't lay them. It only takes a couple of years before you realize that species is now gone.
Since 2015, Florida has spent more than $329 million on beach renourishment projects statewide, more than $60 million in the fiscal year following Hurricane Irma. Honeymoon Island in Dunedin, the busiest state park, just underwent its second project since that 2015 benchmark. Officials say it wasn't even possible for sea turtles to nest on the 3,000-foot stretch that was worked on. In its latest round of funding for the issue, the state announced $100 million in the new state budget, along with an allocation of $50 million in federal stimulus dollars, all earmarked for rebuilding beaches. Here in Tampa Bay, local efforts are underway as well. But rather than renourishing what already exists, volunteers are creating brand new ecosystems.
My name is Richard Radigan. I am the oyster shell program coordinator with Tampa Bay Watch. Our mission has kind of evolved from just bringing oysters back to reducing erosion on many of the shorelines around Tampa Bay. One of our methods is creating living shorelines.
First, oyster balls made up of marine-friendly concrete are installed to break up the waves hitting the shoreline. Next, bags of oyster shells are stacked, tons and tons of the material used every spring and fall season, in the hope that oysters will attach and form a new habitat.
This is an example of one of the oyster shell bags. I mean, it's pretty big. It looks heavy.
Yeah, it's not too bad. It's about 35 pounds. And these are what we deploy into the water.
So right out there, all along the shoreline.
All along the shoreline.
Finally, the last layer of each project is seagrass, completing a new carbon-friendly ecosystem.
When you establish these oyster reef balls and then the shells and then the grass, you are giving habitat to a large number of species. It's such a beneficial area and environment that if we can establish more and more of these, that only helps the water quality in Tampa Bay as a whole.
An open water estuary, the biggest in all of Florida, connected to the Gulf and all of the beauty that lies within, in need of our protection from the new normal now upon us. We've now covered climate change impacts on our homes and the homes of the wildlife here in Florida. But coming up next, something that doesn't get nearly as much attention, and that's your health. Stay with us to find out if you or someone you know is at greater risk. Your health should be a priority, but for some people, there are things just out of their control that make them more susceptible to the effects of climate change. Things like age, race, and even income all play a factor in public health.
Hurricane Irma continues to remain a dangerous and life-threatening Category 4 storm with winds of 155 miles per hour.
It was sheer panic because they told me that they were going to take care of my mother.
911, what is your emergency?
We don't have any air conditioning. I saw her slouch over. I realized that she's not breathing.
As we arrived on the scene with our fire rescue crews, we made the decision to evacuate all of the patients.
At that point, I didn't know if my mother was dead or alive.
Emergency preparedness in the face of a hurricane is a matter of life or death, especially for our most vulnerable. Something our experts say must come into sharp focus now that climatologists predict more powerful and frequent storms.
I'm Lindsay Peterson, and I do research in the School of Aging Studies at the University of South Florida. Older adults, particularly those who are in nursing homes or in some kind of institutional care, are there because they have chronic conditions. It's incredibly important for us to think about what's going on inside these buildings when a hurricane is coming and what becomes of those people after the hurricane has hit.
Consider this, nearly half of Florida's nursing homes lost power during Hurricane Irma. That's 30,000 vulnerable people left without air conditioning in the summer heat.
We might not have electricity in our houses and be extremely uncomfortable. They might not have electricity. They might die.
The most notorious example of this played out in South Florida in the days following Irma's landfall.
My name is Vendetta Craig. I lost my mother December 29th of 2017. She was one of the survivors from Hurricane Irma in the nursing home in Hollywood Hills. That morning of the hurricane, my mother's caseworker called me with concerns she was not able to get in. The next phone call that I received was from my best friend. She said, "I think you should turn the TV on." I turned the TV on, and it was an aerial view from the helicopter, and I recognized it. And they were bringing people out on stretchers. And I knew it was an emergency.
According to reports, the air conditioning at the nursing home was knocked out, and staff members who were later charged neglected to call for help. Residents sat sweltering in the heat for several days before rescue crews evacuated the facility. By then, 8 people had died, 14 residents altogether. Craig's mother, Edna Jefferson, was hospitalized for heat stroke, and though she survived the days and weeks to follow, she never fully recovered.
Once my mother was rescued, she was alive, she was present, but she just wasn't quite the same.
Jefferson passed away 3.5 months later. Peterson calls the entire incident a worst-case scenario, but it also brought to light the lack of disaster planning at these facilities, prompting the state to act.
After the Hollywood Hills incident, Governor Scott reacted very quickly and came in with an order requiring nursing homes and assisted living communities to begin to install generators. And then the state legislature followed up and made this a state law.
Each facility must also have an approved emergency power plan and at least 72 hours worth of fuel on site. In the weeks leading up to hurricane season 2021, the state's database showed more than 24 facilities were not in full compliance. A concern, says Peterson, given how fast extreme heat can cause a health crisis.
Once the internal heating process begins with someone who is older, if their body isn't able to regulate their temperature, then they could easily succumb to heat stroke.
Not just those living in long-term care, but the elderly in general. According to the CDC, more than 1,200 Floridians were hospitalized in 2019 for heat-related illness, a quarter of them over the age of 65. That risk will only rise as days of extreme heat continue to increase. For example, according to the research group Climate Impact Lab, the city of Clearwater saw an average of 42 days at or above 90 degrees back in 1981. Now, that number has climbed to 74 days. And in another 40 years, researchers expect it to jump to 110 days, exposing even more susceptible populations to danger.
My name is Dr. Randall C. Morgan, Chief Executive Officer of the W. Montague Cobb National Medical Association Health Institute. We focus on health disparities. African Americans have for centuries been vulnerable to diseases that can be related to heat. Part of it is because there are underlying health conditions that make them more vulnerable.
High blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, and asthma. When it comes to excess in terms of heat or major weather events, Dr. Morgan says the ability to adapt is more difficult for people of color, and those underlying conditions can get complicated fast. Something brought to light during the pandemic in terms of disproportionate death rates and resistance to vaccinations.
It pulled the sheet back off of what had been hidden in terms of the inequities that make up social determinants of health.
Contributing to further health inequities are living conditions. Climate change and poverty are deeply connected, and neighborhoods with higher pollution rates and lower quality housing tend to be predominantly communities of color. Moving forward, Dr. Morgan and other clinicians pushing for awareness say cities must address climate change through the lens of social justice.
I'm Whit Raymer, and I'm the City of Tampa's first Sustainability and Resilience Officer. Social justice is front and center to the climate crisis. Low-income people disproportionately suffer the worst impacts of climate change. Maybe half of someone's income going to transportation and utility bills. They live in older houses, their air conditioning units aren't as efficient. So we need to put policies in place to help encourage our most vulnerable populations to adapt quickly to climate change.
Tampa is currently looking at programs to help replace older air conditioning units and fund solar energy, and is aiming to bring 10,000 new affordable housing units online by 2027. Raymer also tells us the city just wrapped up an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, which will likely be key in developing a plan to reduce Tampa's carbon footprint.
This is the new normal that we're living in, and there is a degree of uncertainty that we need to plan for. Everyone is trying to figure this out together, and I think that is hopeful.
It's a sentiment shared by all those we spoke with.
Our new normal is evolving. How do we adapt?
This is where I feel like there's a lot of hope. It takes forward-thinking people to move us forward.
It has to be a we thing. It's affecting everybody.
A daunting but vital task to keep this Florida we love, with its beaches and wildlife, vibrant people and lifestyles, for generations to come. That wraps up our special on climate change and what you could call our evolving new normal. We'll have more resources on this up on our app and our website. We thank you for joining us. I'm Kate McVeigh.